All right, this is the lecture on identity and ethnicity for the adolescent psychology class. So, for individuals who are not part of the majority culture, integrating a sense of ethnic identity into their overall sense of personal identity is often an important task in late adolescence. Perhaps just as important as establishing a coherent occupational, ideological, or interpersonal identity. There's been extensive literature that has been amassed on the process through which ethnic identity develops and on the implications of having a strong versus weak sense of ethnic identity for adolescent adjustment and behavior. Ethnic identity has been studied in samples of Black, Hispanic, Native American, Asian, and white youth. In America, white youth generally have a weaker sense of ethnic identity than their non white peers. But many white adolescents, especially those from more working class backgrounds, identify strongly with a particular ethnic group, such as German, Irish, Italian, and derive part of their overall sense of self from this identification. So, again, it kind of depends. It seems to depend somewhat on whether they're part of more a working class family versus another level of economic status. Okay. Nevertheless, if given a list of labels to identify their own ethnic background, white adolescents in America are less likely than ethnic minority adolescents to choose labels based on their specific heritage. So, for example, German, Italian American, Jewish. They're more likely to use generic pan-ethnic labels, for example, white, or simply to identify themselves as American. Among immigrant adolescents, there is considerable vacillation between identifying oneself as a member of a broad ethnic category and identifying oneself as a member of a group defined by one's country of origin. So, by ethnic category, I mean like Latino or Asian, as opposed to the country of origin, which would be Mexican or Chinese as their way of identifying, as well as variability in definitions of how best to maintain an identity that merges between a member of one's ethnic group and being a member of the country into which the family has immigrated. Language and style of dress are often used by immigrant youth to make a statement about their identity. So, the development of ethnic identity. So, the process of ethnic identity development is similar to the process of identity development more generally, with an unquestioning view of oneself often being displaced or upset by a crisis. Often, but not always, the precipitating event involves an experience during which the individual encounters prejudice, becomes aware of his or her group's underrepresentation in some activity or setting, or suddenly feels different from adolescents from other backgrounds. Here's how one Asian American woman described her awakening. I was on the computer chatting with my friend, and he was telling me he had plans to go to Japan to visit for vacation. Then I told him I would like to visit China, and he said to me, China sounds so shady, but you dirty chink would totally fit in anyway. I told him immediately I was offended by his comment, but he thought I was joking about my emotions. I told him to take that comment back because I didn't find it funny. I felt very offended. I was thinking to myself, is that how others view Chinese people? Following the crisis, individuals engage in a period of exploration during which they may immerse themselves in learning about their ethnic heritage. Interestingly, a good deal of this exploration occurs online, as is the case for identity exploration more generally. So, this process of exploration leads to increases in self-esteem. So it's something like to be encouraged if you're a therapist, is to kind of explore that. Eventually, as the value of having a strong ethnic identity becomes clear, the individual establishes a more coherent sense of personal identity that includes this ethnic identity. Adolescents' feelings about their own ethnic group become more positive during both early and middle adolescence, when ethnic identity first becomes salient and individuals become immersed in their own culture, although actual identity exploration does not really begin until middle adolescence. Between middle and late adolescence, exploration declines as individuals begin to develop a more consolidated identity. Adolescents with a strong sense of ethnic identity have better mental health than those whose sense of ethnic identity is more diffuse. One reason for this is that a strong ethnic identity helps to foster a sense of meaning in life, which has been shown to be related to overall adjustment. The development of ethnic identity is profoundly affected by the context in which adolescents live. For instance, patterns of ethnic identity development are affected by the ethnic composition of the adolescent's school, the adolescent's immediate peer group, and the extent to which the adolescent has contact with other teenagers from the same or different backgrounds. Moving through the early stages of ethnic identity development may be speeded up somewhat when parents take a more deliberate approach to the socialization of an ethnic identity. Ethnic socialization, which is defined up on your slide, also referred to as racial socialization, is the process parents use to attempt to teach their children about their ethnic or racial identity and about the special experiences they may encounter within the broader society as a result of their ethnic background. Having a strong ethnic identity and a sense of ethnic pride is consistently associated with higher self-esteem, stronger self-efficacy, and better mental health. Ethnic socialization in minority families typically focuses on at least three themes: understanding and valuing one's culture, dealing with racism, and succeeding in mainstream society. Ethnic socialization also occurs indirectly, for example, when parents stress the importance of family obligations. Ethnic socialization by parents encourages adolescents to think positively about their ethnic heritage, which may lead to a stronger sense of ethnic identity. But more ethnic socialization isn't necessarily better. In one study, the best adjusted Black adolescents came from homes in which their mothers provided a moderate number of racial socialization messages rather than many or few. In fact, when parents and other caregivers describe their own experiences of discrimination, this adversely affects their adolescents' mental health. Occasionally, communication of higher positive messages may be most effective approach for parents to take. Frequent contact with peers from the same ethnic group leads adolescents to develop stronger positive feelings about their ethnicity. But having positive attitudes about one's own ethnic group also is correlated with having positive attitudes about adolescents from other ethnic groups, suggesting that ethnic socialization may enhance rather than upset interracial relations. In fact, many adolescents with a strong ethnic identity are members of peer crowds for which ethnicity is not a defining feature. The mental health of ethnic minority youth is also affected by their orientation to the mainstream culture. In general, positive mental health among ethnic minority adolescents is associated with biculturalism. So that's an important definition, biculturalism, which is having a strong positive ethnic identity and a healthy awareness of the potential for discrimination while maintaining involvement in the mainstream culture. For example, among ethnic minority youth, academic achievement is highest when adolescents feel connected to their ethnic group, are aware of racism, and believe that it is important to the people in their life to be academically successful within mainstream society. Being aware of potential racism and mistrusting others are not the same thing. However, awareness of racism is associated with better achievement, but mistrust is associated with doing more poorly in school. Recent immigrants. So, several researchers have focused on the special situation of ethnic minority youth who are recent immigrants to a new culture. Despite the fact that adolescents who are recent immigrants frequently report higher levels of academic, familial, social, and economic stress, foreign born ethnic minority adolescents tend to express more positive feelings about mainstream American ideals than do their counterparts whose families have been in the United States longer. In addition, in the United States, foreign born and first generation ethnic minority youth, so adolescents whose parents were born in a different country, perform better in school and are less likely to be involved in delinquent behavior or have physical, emotional, and behavioral problems than adolescents from the same ethnic group whose parents were born in America. A phenomenon that's known as the immigrant paradox. The immigrant paradox is not always seen in countries outside the United States, however. One explanation for this is that ethnic minority immigrants arrive in their new country idealistic about their prospects, but the longer their family lives in the new context, the more likely they are to become both Americanized and disillusioned. One recent study of Mexican American youth also found that over the course of adolescence, there was a decline in teenagers' orientation to traditional Mexican family values, which was associated with increases in risky behavior. Another explanation for the higher achievement and better mental health of immigrant adolescents is that newly arrived immigrant parents provide more effective supervision of their children. The process of identity development among adolescents from recent immigrant families also depends on the context in which the family lives, as a study of Vietnamese adolescents from Southern California illustrates. In this study, the researchers compared the identity development of adolescents living in a Vietnamese enclave, Little Saigon, with those who lived nearby but in a more diverse community. For adolescents living inside the enclave, inside Little Saigon, pressures on them to adopt a strong Vietnamese identity had both helped focus their identity development but also constrained it, frustrating those teenagers whose behavior conflicted with the expectations of adults in the community. As one little girl, well, she wasn't little, but a teenager, right? As one girl from Little Saigon noted, you want to do what makes you feel happy or comfortable, but they put you in this little ethnicity box, especially here. Going to church, you wear a traditional Vietnamese dress. I'm not rebelling, but I don't want to be another Asian girl in an American crowd. I want to be myself. I'm not going against my parents or tradition. I want to make my own morals and traditions, and it makes me happy. Adolescents living outside of Little Saigon, outside of the enclave, had more opportunities to explore a wider range of alternatives, but were more passive in their identity exploration and often actively fought attempts by their parents to encourage a strong Vietnamese identity. As one boy put it, my parents expect me to speak Vietnamese consistently. Every now and then they just say that I forget it and that I forgot it and that I don't know how to speak it anymore. Of course I understand it, and my parents expect me to be in a Viet club or something, but I mean, come on, really, come on. Okay. So discrimination and its effects. The task of developing a coherent sense of identity is much more complicated for minority adolescents than for their majority counterparts. Because identity development is profoundly influenced by the social context in which the adolescent lives, the development of minority adolescents must be understood in relation to the specific context that they face in contemporary society. All too often, this context includes racial stereotypes, discrimination, and mixed messages about the cost and benefits of identifying too closely with the majority culture. The adverse effects of discrimination are especially intense among American ethnic minority youth with a strong attachment to the mainstream culture, and for those whose parents were born in the United States. Immigrant adolescents who speak with an accent are stereotyped as perpetual foreigners, which can lead to discrimination and victimization. One recent study of American adolescents of Iranian descent revealed that many of these teenagers identified themselves as Persian rather than Iranian because of the negative portrayals of Iranian individuals in the media. Similarly, it is important to fully understand the process of ethnic identity development among American Indian adolescents without taking into account the particular history of American Indians in the United States. It is well established that individuals from any group, who report experiencing high levels of discrimination suffer psychologically as a result. Adolescents' psychological well-being, including their self-esteem, is adversely affected by discrimination and prejudice. Adolescents who report frequent experiences of being insulted, excluded, and teased about their race or ethnicity have relatively more psychological problems than do their peers who face no discrimination. Many studies of Asian, Black, and Latino youth have found that feeling discriminated against is predictive of subsequent conduct problems, depression, and lower achievement in school. The source of the discrimination matters. Feeling discriminated against by teachers leads to poor school performance, whereas peer discrimination adversely affects mental health. There are many reasons that feeling discriminated against may be harmful to one's mental health, but one important process derives from the effect of discrimination on adolescents' feelings of control. Adolescents who feel discriminated against in school report feeling less control over their academic achievement, which leads to feelings of depression. Another possibility is that the experience of discrimination leads to depression and alienation, which in turn leads adolescents to affiliate with deviant peers, increasing the likelihood that they will engage in risky and antisocial behavior. Growing up in a racially isolated poor neighborhood especially intensifies feelings of discrimination, which increases adolescents' involvement in violence. Individuals vary both in the extent to which they feel discriminated against and in the extent to which they are adversely affected by it. And it appears that ethnic identity is an important factor. The multidimensional model of racial identity has been used to help make sense out of the complex web of findings. According to this model, we need to take into account three different aspects of racial identity. So, racial centrality, how important race is in defining individuals' identity; private regard, which is how individuals feel about being a member of their race; and public regard, how individuals think others view their race. Generally speaking, during adolescence, racial centrality increases and private regard tends to remain stable, but changes in public regard differ among adolescents from different backgrounds. In one study of New York City middle school students, public regard increased among Chinese American adolescents, but it declined among Black, Puerto Rican, and Dominican youth. One possible explanation for this is that Black and Latino students report that their teachers have more negative attitude towards them than do Asian youth, whose teachers generally see them in a more favorable light. Adolescents who have experienced discrimination firsthand are more likely to believe that the public has low regard for their ethnic group. However, individuals who believe that the public has low regard for their ethnic group are more sensitive to racial cues, which in turn may heighten their experience of discrimination. This process may be accentuated in families where parents engage in relatively more ethnic socialization. This is not to say that individuals with heightened sensitivity to discrimination are simply imagining it. Rather, individuals with heightened sensitivity may be better at perceiving more subtle signs of genuine racial bias. One recent study found that the experience of feeling discriminated against adversely affects adolescents' mental health, regardless of what they attribute the discrimination to. How all of this works together to affect adolescents' mental health is tricky. Having positive feelings about one's race is positively linked to psychological well-being and protects against the harmful effects of stress and discrimination. Consistent with this, adolescents whose parents have emphasized the positive family relationships fare better in the face of discrimination than those whose parents have emphasized the negative. Having a strong ethnic identity is also protective against the harmful effects of online discrimination. However, the impact of having race as a central part of one's identity, which is not the same thing as having high private regard for one's ethnic group, is complicated. It makes adolescents more sensitive to discrimination, which hurts their mental health. But some studies show that it makes them more able to cope with it, although not all studies find this. Believing that the public has high regard for one's ethnic group lifts adolescents' school performance, but believing that the public has a positive view of one's race also intensifies the effects of discrimination, perhaps because people feel especially wounded when they don't expect to encounter it. Multi-ethnic adolescents. One understudied group of adolescents for whom developing a sense of ethnic identity may be especially challenging consists of multi-ethnic youth, adolescents whose parents are not from the same ethnic or racial group. Understanding psychological development among multi-ethnic adolescents has taken an increased importance as their numbers have grown. In 2010, 17% of all infants with a black parent were born to one black parent and one white parent, and 34% of all infants with an Asian parent were born to one Asian parent and one white parent. Developing a consistent ethnic identity is challenging for biracial adolescents, especially during early adolescence. Many biracial adolescents change their racial identity over time, switching between adolescence and young adulthood from being biracial to being monoracial, which is identifying oneself with just one ethnic group. In one study of black, white, and biracial black-white adolescents, nearly 3/4 of the biracial group changed their self-identification over a 4-year period, which may reflect the ways in which the cultural desirability of being seen as a member of one ethnic group or another fluctuates over time. Although this switching has been observed in all ethnic groups, in one study it was especially common among adolescents who identified as Native Americans, either exclusively or in combination with a white self-identification. The majority of individuals who had identified themselves as both white and Native American when they were adolescents identified themselves only as white when they were young adults. However, a large number of adolescents who identified themselves only as white identified themselves as both white and Native American several years later. Similar patterns of change were seen among other multicultural individuals, but not nearly as often.